The banquet hall smelled of cheap wine and overcooked steak, but the sting of humiliation cut sharper than any knife. Elliot Harper, 34, stood frozen at the entrance, his tailored blazer suddenly feeling too tight as a smug usher pointed him toward a lone chair by the restroom door. "That's your seat?" the man sneered, his voice dripping with disdain, as if Elliot's very presence was an inconvenience. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Elliot had arrived in Burlington, Vermont, expecting to deliver a keynote address as Harvard's youngest guest professor of sociology, invited to speak at the university's annual diversity gala. His groundbreaking research on marginalized communities had earned him accolades. But tonight, the gala committee had made a grave mistake. They'd seen his name, his face, and the quiet mention of his partner, Mateo, in his bio, and decided to seat him by the toilet for being gay. Elliot's jaw tightened as he crossed the room, the murmurs of the crowd fading into a dull roar. He was used to microaggressions, the subtle jabs that came with being a black, queer academic in spaces not built for him. But this was deliberate. The chair, isolated and shoved against a wall near the men's room, screamed of intent. He sat, his posture rigid, his dark eyes scanning the room for a familiar face. None appeared. Across town, Mateo Alvarez, 29, was running late. His beat-up pickup truck rattled along the icy roads, the heater barely keeping up with the February chill. A community organizer with a fire in his heart, Mateo had spent the day rallying local activists for a youth shelter project. His curly hair was a mess, his sweater slightly frayed, but his passion for justice burned brighter than ever. He'd promised Elliot he'd make it to the gala, even if it meant speeding through Burlington's quiet streets. Mateo didn't know about the seating arrangement. He didn't know that Elliot, the man he loved, was sitting alone, humiliated, in a room full of strangers. But he felt a gnawing unease as he parked outside the venue, his breath fogging in the cold air. Something was wrong. He could always tell when Elliot needed him. Inside, Elliot's fingers traced the edge of his water glass, his mind racing. He could leave. He could walk out, call the organizers out later, and let the scandal unfold. But that wasn't who he was. Elliot Harper didn't run from fights. He studied them, dissected them, turned them into lessons for a world that refused to learn. Still, the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. He wasn't just a professor tonight. He was a symbol, a target, a man whose love for another man had been weaponized against him. The gala's host, a silver-haired woman named Dr. Cynthia Wells, took the stage, her voice booming through the microphone. "Tonight, we celebrate diversity, inclusion, and the power of knowledge to transform lives." The crowd clapped, oblivious to the irony. Elliot's seat creaked as he shifted, the restroom door swinging open behind him, blasting him with the stench of industrial cleaner. He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. Mateo slipped into the venue just as the speeches began, his eyes scanning the crowded room. He spotted Elliot immediately, not at the head table, not among the honored guests, but alone, tucked away like an afterthought. His heart sank. Mateo knew that look on Elliot's face. The tight jaw, the guarded eyes, the quiet fury of a man who'd been disrespected one too many times. Without hesitation, he wove through the tables, ignoring the curious glances from the mostly white, affluent crowd. "Elliot," Mateo whispered, crouching beside him. "What the hell is this?" Elliot's gaze softened at the sight of Mateo, but his voice was low, strained. "They decided this is where I belong." Mateo's eyes blazed. "Who did this? Tell me their names." "Not now," Elliot said, his hand brushing Mateo's. "Just sit with me." Mateo hesitated, his activist instincts screaming to confront the organizers, to demand answers. But he saw the exhaustion in Elliot's eyes, the plea for solidarity over spectacle. He pulled up a chair, ignoring the usher's glare, and sat close, their shoulders touching. The small act of defiance felt like a lifeline. As Dr. Wells droned on about progress, Elliot leaned toward Mateo, his voice barely audible. "They don't know who I am. Not yet." Mateo grinned, a spark of mischief in his dark eyes. "Then let's show them." The gala continued, a parade of self-congratulation and hollow platitudes. Elliot listened, his mind cataloging every word, every glance, every slight. He was a sociologist, after all. He saw patterns where others saw only chaos. And tonight, the pattern was clear. This room, these people, they weren't ready for him. Not for his intellect, not for his truth, not for his love. But Elliot Harper had never needed their permission to exist. And with Mateo by his side, he felt the first stirrings of a plan. Not just to survive this night, but to turn it into a reckoning. The speeches dragged on, each one more performative than the last. Elliot's isolation by the restroom became a silent protest, a beacon of their ignorance. Mateo's hand found his under the table, a quiet promise. "We're in this together." And as the crowd clapped for another empty speech, Elliot's resolve hardened. He wasn't just a guest professor. He was a force, and this room was about to learn exactly what that meant. The gala's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the faces of the attendees. Elliot's gaze drifted from the stage to the crowd, each face a study in privilege, smiling, clapping, oblivious to the man they'd relegated to the margins. His fingers tightened around Mateo's, grounding him in the moment. He wasn't here to blend in. He was here to disrupt. Mateo, meanwhile, was barely containing his anger. His knee bounced under the table, a restless rhythm that matched the fire in his chest. He'd seen this before, systems designed to exclude, to diminish, to silence. As a community organizer, he'd fought landlords who evicted queer tenants, employers who fired trans workers, politicians who ignored the marginalized. But seeing Elliot, his brilliant, unshakable Elliot, treated like this, it was personal. "Elliot," Mateo whispered, leaning closer, "you don't have to stay. We can walk out, make a statement. I'll call the local press right now." Elliot's lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes were steel. "Walking out lets them win. They think they can shame me into silence. They're wrong." Mateo nodded, his admiration for Elliot swelling. He'd always loved Elliot's quiet strength, the way he turned pain into purpose. But tonight, that strength felt like a shield, protecting them both from the room's hostility. On stage, Dr. Wells introduced the next speaker, a corporate diversity consultant named Bradley Klein. His speech was a masterclass in buzzwords: equity, inclusion, allyship, each word landing like a slap to Elliot's face. He wondered if Klein even noticed the irony of preaching inclusion while a black, queer professor sat by the restroom. Probably not. Elliot's mind flashed to his childhood in Atlanta, where he'd learned early that being black and gay meant navigating a world that rarely made space for you. His mother, a schoolteacher, had taught him to hold his head high, to outsmart the systems that tried to break him. His father, a mechanic, had shown him how to stand firm, even when the world pushed back. Those lessons had carried him to Harvard, to lecture halls and boardrooms, to a life he'd built with Mateo. And now, here he was, reduced to a seat by the toilet. The restroom door swung open again, the smell of bleach cutting through the air. A man in a cheap suit smirked as he passed, muttering something under his breath. Mateo's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, but Elliot squeezed his hand. "Not worth it," he murmured. "It's worth it to me," Mateo shot back, his voice low but fierce. "They don't get to do this to you." "They already did," Elliot said, his tone calm but laced with resolve. Now it's my turn. As the applause for Klein's speech faded, Dr. Wells returned to the microphone. And now, we're thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Elliot Harper, guest professor at Harvard University, whose work on marginalized communities has reshaped our understanding of equity. The room went silent, a ripple of confusion spreading through the crowd. Heads turned, searching for the esteemed professor. Elliot stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his blazer impeccable despite the indignity of his seat. Mateo's hand lingered on his, a silent "you've got this." Elliot walked to the stage, each step measured, his presence commanding. The usher who'd seated him by the toilet froze, his face paling as realization hit. Whispers spread like wildfire. "That's him. The guy by the bathroom?" Elliot reached the podium, his dark eyes scanning the room, meeting every gaze that dared to look away. "Thank you, Dr. Wells," he began, his voice steady, resonant. "I'm honored to be here, though I must say, the seating arrangement was unexpected." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd, but Elliot's expression didn't waver. "Tonight, you've heard a lot about diversity, about inclusion, about progress. But let me tell you what progress looks like from where I was seated, by the restroom, alone, because someone decided my identity made me less worthy of respect." The room went still. Dr. Wells shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The usher looked like he wanted to disappear. Mateo, still at the back, grinned fiercely, his heart swelling with pride. Elliot continued, his voice rising with controlled passion. "I study systems of power, of privilege, of exclusion. And tonight I experienced one firsthand. But I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to challenge you. Because true inclusion isn't a buzzword. It's not a gala. It's not a speech. It's the courage to confront your biases, to question your assumptions, to make space for those you've pushed to the margins." The crowd was rapt, some leaning forward, others squirming. Elliot's words cut deep, exposing the hypocrisy of the evening. He spoke of his research, of the queer and black communities he'd fought for, of the resilience he'd seen in the face of systemic hatred. But he also spoke of love, of Mateo, of their life together, of the strength they drew from each other. Mateo listened, his eyes glistening. He'd always known Elliot was brilliant, but this was incandescent. Elliot wasn't just speaking, he was rewriting the narrative of the room, forcing them to see him, to see them. As Elliot's speech ended, the applause was thunderous, though some hands stayed still, their owners too uncomfortable to join in. He returned to his seat, Mateo pulling him into a quick, fierce hug. "You were incredible," Mateo whispered. "We're not done yet," Elliot replied, a spark in his eyes. The gala's energy had shifted. Elliot's speech hung in the air like a storm that had just broken, leaving the room raw and exposed. Some attendees approached him afterward, offering awkward apologies or praise, their words stumbling over their guilt. Others avoided his gaze, retreating to their cliques, whispering about the incident. Elliot remained composed, shaking hands, nodding politely, but inside, he was strategizing. Mateo, meanwhile, was a live wire. He'd slipped out to the parking lot to call a friend at the local newspaper, planting the seed for a story about the gala's blunder. He wasn't one for subtlety. Mateo believed in action, in making noise, in holding people accountable. But he also knew Elliot preferred a quieter approach, one that changed minds through reason rather than rage. It was one of the things he loved about him. Their differences made them stronger. Back inside, the gala transitioned to a networking session, the crowd mingling over cocktails and dessert. Elliot and Mateo stayed by their table, now a focal point for curious onlookers. A young woman, a graduate student named Aisha, approached, her eyes wide with admiration. "Dr. Harper, your speech, it was everything. I'm studying sociology at UVM, and your work on intersectionality is why I'm here. Elliot smiled, his first genuine one of the night. Thank you, Aisha. Keep asking the hard questions. That's where change starts. Aisha hesitated, then lowered her voice. I heard what they did to you. The seating. It's disgusting. I'm so sorry. It's not your apology to make, Elliot said gently. But it's your generation that'll fix this. Aisha nodded, emboldened, and walked away with a new fire in her step. Mateo watched her go, then turned to Elliot. You're building an army, you know that? Elliot chuckled, but his eyes were distant. I just want them to think. Really think. The moment was interrupted by Dr. Wells, who approached with a tight smile, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Dr. Harper, I owe you an apology. The seating was a misunderstanding. We'll ensure it never happens again. Elliot's gaze was unflinching. A misunderstanding doesn't place someone by the restroom, Dr. Wells. A decision does. Who made it? Her smile faltered. I'll look into it. I promise. Mateo crossed his arms, his voice low but sharp. You should, because this isn't just about tonight. It's about every time someone like us is pushed aside. Dr. Wells nodded quickly, clearly eager to escape the conversation. As she walked away, Elliot sighed. She's not the problem. She's just part of it. Then who's the problem? Mateo asked, his frustration bubbling up. The usher? The committee? Give me a name, Elliot. I'll take this to the board. Elliot shook his head. It's bigger than a name. It's a system, and systems don't change with one fight. Mateo frowned, but he didn't argue. He knew Elliot was right, even if it made his blood boil. They stood together, watching the crowd, two men against a world that wasn't ready for them, but they were ready for it. As the night wound down, Elliot and Mateo slipped out to the lakefront, needing air, needing space. The Vermont night was crisp, the stars sharp against the dark sky. They sat on a bench, their breath visible in the cold, their hands intertwined. I'm proud of you, Mateo said, his voice soft. You turned their garbage into something powerful. Elliot leaned his head against Mateo's shoulder. I couldn't have done it without you here. They sat in silence, the lake lapping gently against the shore. For a moment the world felt smaller, kinder, but they both knew the fight wasn't over. The gala was just one battle in a war they'd been fighting their whole lives. Back at their hotel, Elliot sat at the desk, typing notes for his next lecture. Mateo sprawled on the bed, scrolling through his phone, already seeing posts about the gala on X. The story was spreading: Elliot's speech, the seating debacle, the university's embarrassment. Mateo grinned. They're gonna regret messing with you. Elliot didn't look up from his laptop. Let them talk. It's not about regret. It's about change. The next morning, Burlington buzzed with the fallout. Local news outlets had picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with hashtags. Justice for Elliot, End Queer Erasure. Mateo read the posts aloud over breakfast, his voice a mix of triumph and indignation. Elliot listened quietly, sipping his coffee, his mind already on the bigger picture. They'd planned to spend the day exploring Burlington, but the university had other ideas. A flurry of emails arrived, each one more apologetic than the last. The gala committee requested a meeting, promising corrective action. Elliot agreed, but on his terms. The meeting would be public, streamed live, and include student voices. The meeting took place in a lecture hall, packed with students, faculty, and curious locals. Elliot sat at the front, Mateo beside him, their presence a quiet challenge to the room's power structure. Dr. Wells opened with another apology, her voice trembling under the weight of the cameras. We failed Dr. Harper, and we failed our values. We're committed to making this right. Elliot leaned forward, his voice calm but piercing. Making it right starts with accountability. Who decided where I sat? And why? The room tensed. A junior staff member, a nervous man named Greg, admitted to the seating arrangement, claiming it was a logistical error. But under Elliot's steady gaze, Greg's story unraveled. He'd been told to prioritize certain guests, and Elliot's identity, black, gay, outspoken, had made him a target. Mateo's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent, letting Elliot lead. The students, however, weren't so restrained. Aisha stood, her voice shaking with anger. This isn't just about Dr. Harper. It's about every queer student, every student of color who's been made to feel less than. When will you stop hiding behind errors? The room erupted in applause, and Elliot felt a surge of hope. These were the voices that would carry the fight forward. He spoke next, outlining a plan: mandatory bias training, a student-led diversity council, and public reporting on inclusion efforts. The committee agreed, visibly shaken by the pressure. After the meeting, Elliot and Mateo walked through Burlington's Church Street, the winter sun casting long shadows. They stopped at a cafe, the same one they'd visit later that evening, its warm lights a contrast to the gala's cold formality. Over coffee, Mateo reached for Elliot's hand. You're changing things, you know? Not just here, but everywhere. Elliot smiled, but his eyes were tired. It's a start, but it's exhausting, Mateo. Sometimes I just want to be us, not a cause. Mateo squeezed his hand. Then let's be us tonight. No speeches, no fights. Just you and me. That evening, they returned to the cafe, the lake shimmering outside. They sat close, their hands touching, their laughter soft. For the first time in days, Elliot felt light, unburdened. Mateo's eyes sparkled as he talked about their future. Maybe a house in Vermont, maybe a dog, maybe a life where they didn't have to fight so hard to be seen. Months later, the impact of that night rippled outward. The university implemented Elliot's recommendations, and the story of his gala experience became a case study in his lectures, a testament to the power of resilience. Mateo's activism took on new energy, his youth shelter project gaining traction with support from students inspired by Elliot's speech. But the true victory wasn't in the policies or the headlines. It was in the quiet moments, the ones no one else saw. It was Elliot and Mateo cooking dinner in their Cambridge apartment, laughing over a burnt casserole. It was their late-night walks by the Charles River, dreaming of a world that didn't demand they justify their love. It was the way they held each other, fierce and unapologetic, in a world that still had so much to learn. One evening, as they sat on their balcony, Elliot turned to Mateo, his voice soft. You know, that night at the gala I thought I'd break. But you were there. You always are. Mateo grinned, pulling him close. And I always will be. Their love wasn't just a defiance of the world's cruelty. It was a celebration of its possibilities. They'd faced humiliation, fought for justice, and emerged stronger, together. And as the stars blinked above, Elliot knew that no seat by a toilet, no system, no hatred could dim what they'd built. The world would keep pushing, but they would keep pushing back. Hand in hand, heart to heart, unyielding in their truth.